Now, remembering that error theory is a cognitivist moral theory, and thus asserts that moral propositions are truth-apt, error theory goes further in asserting that they are all false. Error theory is championed primarily, although not exclusively, by the philosopher J.L. Mackie. Now, Mackie argues for this in several ways, but his best argument, in my opinion, is what he calls the argument from queerness. Essentially, in the argument from queerness, Mackie points out that when we are evaluating the truth value of regular propositions, for instance, the sky is blue, I'm sitting on my bed, there is a unicorn holding the camera, and so forth, we refer to objects in the world to give them their value of true. But Mackie points out that there's no kind of object in the world which we could point to make any moral proposition true. So he calls the kind of object that would be necessary to assert the truth of a moral proposition a queer object, the kind of thing of which we have no experience and for which we have no evidence. One example of a queer object is God. God is this mysterious kind of object of which we have no experience and for which we have no evidence, that is the kind of thing which can make moral propositions true. Plato's realm of the forms is another example of a queer object. It's this strange heaven-like place which we don't know anything about and we have no evidence for. Now, the other three kinds of moral realisms I mentioned suffer from exactly the same problem. Now, they don't typically assert the existence of some one of these queer objects for a variety of reasons, I'm sure, but they suffer from exactly the same problem. They make moral propositions, which they assert to be actually, literally, absolutely true, and they have no evidence supporting these things. They have nothing in the world to which they can point to sort of endorse that truth value of true. Now, Mackie goes a bit too far with this. He concludes from the lack of evidence about the existence of these queer objects that all moral propositions are false. Now, this is a logical misstep in exactly the same way that strong atheism involves a logical misstep. Now, remembering that strong atheism is the view that there is no God. Strong atheists conclude from the lack of evidence of God that there actually isn't one. And we can't do that. The best we can do, and be logically defensible, is be weak atheists. Weak atheism is the view that, since we have no evidence for the existence of God, there's simply no reason to believe in God, but not specifically that there isn't a God. Essentially, weak atheism puts God in the same category as Zeus, the Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, and so forth. So Mackie is essentially the equivalent of a strong atheist with respect to queer objects. He sort of believes that there aren't any, and thus we should believe that moral propositions are all false. A more reasonable and rational and consistent way of thinking about morality is that there is simply no evidence for any such queer object which would make moral propositions true, and thus there is no reason to believe in one. So we should treat moral propositions as being false, even if they aren't literally false. It's just that we have no reason to believe they are true. So, to summarize up to this point, first, no, it is not true that without God it is impossible to have absolute morality. We can adopt any of those other moral realisms which I mentioned. But it doesn't make sense to. It's not consistent to believe in absolute morality of any kind as a weak atheist, at least insofar as we are concerned with logical consistency in our view of the world. And I think most of us as weak atheists are concerned with logical consistency in our views. So what can we do from here? I mean, should we just run around raping people at whim because it would feel good, it would be a fun thing to do? I mean, But no, we should not. Well, let's think of it like this. We're trying to figure out what we should do. We could view Mackie's argument from queerness as essentially a version of David Hume's famous is-ought problem. Now, what is the is-ought problem? Well, essentially, it's the observation that no matter how much we look at, or talk about, or reason about the world as it is, we cannot conclude logically anything about the way it ought to be, or how we ought to act. Now, the commonly accepted solution to David Hume's Aesop problem is that we can still talk about how we ought to act and what we should do with respect to some goal or other. For instance, if I have the goal of going to the store and picking up some milk, then I should act in some certain objectively definable way to achieve that goal. Now, if my goal includes getting it as fast as possible, there is some particular way of getting that milk the fastest. If my goal involves getting it the cheapest, then there is some other particular way I should act to get the milk the cheapest. Now, we've all got goals, so all we need to know in order to figure out how we should act is we need to know what our goals are. Nothing more than that. We've all got goals, big or small, lofty or trivial, but we've all got them. And further, most of us have certain goals in common, typically the bigger goals, the broader reaching goals. For instance, I have a goal to live in a society in which myself and my family and my children and my friends and so forth can live in safety. They don't have to worry about where their next meal is going to come from. They don't have to worry about being killed at random. That is an objective goal. And as an objective goal, there is some one way that I ought to act to bring about that goal. And it probably involves coordination of action with others who share that same goal. And I can guarantee you that most people on Earth, not all, but most, share that same goal. I think we are genetically predisposed, in fact, to have goals of that kind. So, now that we've all got this goal, we can start speaking in earnest and objectively, not relativistically or subjectively, about how we ought to act with respect to this goal. The goal is objective, and the solution is objective. In discovering how we ought to act, both individually and as a society, we can reference evidence. We can talk about the way the world is. We can look at scientific studies that have been done in sociology, psychology, economics, biology, all the fields of science, and figure out what we should do to bring about this ideal world. Morality is just as simple as that. So in conclusion, let me just summarize a bit. First, the charge that it's impossible to have an absolute morality without God is false. Second, while it is false, it makes no more sense to believe in any absolute morality, divine command or otherwise, than it makes sense to believe in God. So as weak atheists, we cannot defensively believe in any absolute morality. Third, we do not need an absolute morality to objectively speak about how we ought to act. And fourth and finally, I want to say, why would we even want an absolute morality? I mean, the conditions of the world are in constant flux. Why would we want an absolute, unchanging, inflexible rule set to follow when the world in which it is applied is constantly changing? It just doesn't make sense. Our goals change, and thus it makes sense that the way we ought to act should change along with them.